2, and we're live. Hi there, Michael.
Hi, good evening, good morning. Hello.
Exactly. It's evening where you are. Part of the joke is we're doing a science Thursday, and yet it's Friday for me. So it is Friday morning. I'm in Sydney, Australia, and you're in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, United States of America.
Yes.
Great. And we're here to talk about dark energy, Dask, the universe things. I know a lot about Dask. I don't know a lot about dark energy. I know some things about the local universe, but I'm really excited to learn from you about dark energy and how you use Dask to think about these things. I'll also just quickly say, anyone joining, we would love for you to just say who you are in the chat, what your interest in Dask or dark energy is. It'd be nice to hear from you. But with all that having been said, Michael, maybe perhaps you could tell us a bit about yourself and your interest in all of these fascinating things.
My name is Michael Wood-Vasey. I've grown up wanting to know what the universe is made of. As a small child, I told my mom, someday I'm going to figure out how the universe came to be and what it's made of, and I'm going to write a book. And so she gave that to me when I graduated, and I've kind of found myself on that path. But that path has been one of loving the computational side of things as well. So I want to know what the universe is made of, but my technical skills are in making computers dance and processing large imaging data sets to try to discover things about the universe.
Fascinating. So as I mentioned to you before, I used to work in cell biology and biophysics, and I think it's a growing combination of skill sets, or a Venn diagram or convergence of research scientists really learning the computational skills necessary to answer the questions that they're interested in. Did you come from computer science, or come from basic research and learn all the skills on the side, or how? Because it's a lot to think about and a lot to learn, right?
I will admit that the first week of my freshman year at Harvey Mudd College, I sat down and figured out how I could triple measure in physics, math, and computer science. Wow. And I didn't, at that age, from my perspective, like, it's nice to have goals. And all my professors like, just take the classes. Who cares what the diploma says, right? But like, I was very sort of goal focused. Now I totally agree with them. I tell the students the same thing. So I did degrees in math and physics, but each with a strong computational bent and side to things. And so that was sort of my course through undergraduate, those interests. And I mean, I'm also a violinist on the side, but to be blunt, the economics of being an amateur violinist on the side and a professional physicist work a little better than the other way around. Mm-hmm. Actually, the funding on both sides, not just whether you get paid well, but it's actually very expensive to run a physics lab or to have a huge telescope. And that's difficult as an amateur. Although, actually, to pivot a little bit to why I'm really excited about the project I'm working on now, the Ruben Observatory, is the mission of the Ruben Observatory and its legacy survey of space and time, LSST, is in fact to share the sky with everyone. To mean that you don't have to be a rich institution with your own huge telescope, but this huge telescope is for everyone.
And so does that mean that the data is open as well?
Almost open. It is open for everyone in the US and Chile, and for international partners who have made in-kind contributions. The funding comes from the US National Science Foundation, Department of Energy. And so that's sort of their mission. I think many of us in the project are like, we want it to be open to everyone all the time. Right now, there are two key things that will be open. 2 years after data are taken and released released to the big collaboration, they'll then become world public. But the other really interesting thing, near and dear to my heart, is LSST will be taking a movie of the sky. So we look at the sky and we see that things change. So here's a part of the sky. This is actually a simulation, but it's a very realistic simulation. You see stars and galaxies, and the stars vary in brightness, and sometimes asteroids move across the field. And you have supernova, exploding stars, and other galaxies that go off, and you see changes. And Ruben Observatory and LSST are going to be able to take a movie of the sky every 3 nights. And every image taken, there'll be some new thing. And in fact, there'll be tens of thousands of new things every image. And all of those will go out as alerts in a stream of data coming out. And those will be public to everyone.
Great. And I think about open data a lot. And I do think with all the talk about open data, this is why I'm very interested in computational skills as well. Is open is one thing, but if not everyone has the skill set to work with it or analyze it or see it in certain forms of richness, is it really that open? So how do we equip people with the skills to access open data as well? Like,
100% agree. Yeah.
New York City says they've got all their metro data, subway data is open, but you try to use their API and get the spreadsheets or whatever, and it is brutal.
Right. And I think there's that key part. And I totally appreciate and agree with all those things. I mean, clearly there's a push of open access to the data and journal articles. Let's actually talk about journal articles like in one thing. Absolutely, totally. They should be accessible. But literally making them available is not the same thing as actually making them accessible.
Yeah.
Reading the latest cell biology research of what's happening at a molecular cell membrane level of one particular chemical interaction might seem related to some large scale disease or something. But I can't actually really read that article and actually make a life decision based on that, right? There's a lot of context and things that work. And of course, if you're any laboratory stuff, lots of stuff works in the test tube that does not work in the person because it's just much more complicated system. Yeah. So I would like to see both of those angles. I mean, yes, absolutely. Let's make this stuff open. Let's at least make it available. But we need to come at the accessibility, and that's from two sides. One is making those data more accessible from the people who did it. And then the other is equipping more and more people just with the generic tools in math and science and data science and computational skills, not designing the next chip, not even running a large simulation of the universe, but allowing the computer to be that exoskeleton that allows you to ask questions you couldn't ask otherwise.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned research, and we won't really touch upon it, but we haven't even touched upon, the fact that a lot of the time it's behind an Elsevier or paywall, right? For a lot of people.
There is that. I mean, the interesting culture in astronomy specifically is, yes, that's true. And yes,
but
we
it's
have
archived,
journals, but everything's also on archive.org.
So good.
Everything. And all the publishers are totally fine with that. Well, specifically, it's because the journals are owned by the professional societies. They're not owned by the publishers. So,
fascinating. Has that always been the case in astronomy?
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest exception that people read is Nature Astronomy. I think that's sort of the only private title that we have law. But the key journals, Astronomy, Astrophysics, Monthly Notices, Royal Astronomical Society, sort of in Europe and in the UK. And then the US, the American Astronomical Society has the Astrophysical Journal, Astronomical Journal. All those journals are run by the societies whose entire purpose is to provide that. So they're totally on board with the archive. And
fantastic.
It really works well. Yeah.
And something I'm hearing there, it's kind of like a stakeholder model of governance as opposed to a quote unquote shareholder model. I lived in Germany for some time, and they've got very interesting, housing cooperatives and that type of stuff where, it's stakeholders have a lot of say as opposed to people who don't have certain forms of skin in the game, which I find fascinating. But looking at this, 20 billion galaxies, 17 billion stars, 6 million solar system objects, 60-second alerts. The size, the resolution, the density seems incredibly large. What? And this is probably a leading question. I'm not quite sure what the answer is. But what size of data sets are we talking about here?
Right. So these data, the simple number is over 10 years, we'll have 15 petabytes. Which is large, but not inconceivable. Most of those data are the individual image pixel data, and most users will not be reanalyzing those all the time. We are going to cover the sky. So the Vera Rubin Observatory is here's a model sketched. Actually looks basically like this right now, except it really exists, is going to cover the visible sky. Now, this is in Chile. Shout out to our Southern Hemisphere colleagues.
Yeah, exactly. And
Chile has
in the north of Chile, in the desert?
Yeah, not quite all the way in the north, just a little southwest. So there's the Atacama Desert where things are dry, and we put up the big radio telescopes. We're a little south. We're at -30 declination.
Okay, good.
And one of the reasons we're there, I mean, similar to the dryness at the telescopes, but just as an atmospheric point of view, those tend to be the dry areas in the north and the south. Similar latitudes, Mexico, the southern parts of, or southwest of the United States. Southeast is influenced differently from the Atlantic, but those tend to be the dry bands there. And Chile has a wonderful, amazing assortment of mountains to choose from, and have been partners for a long time in astronomy with the international community. So we'll be down in Chile, 20 terabytes a night, 10 years, 45 billion objects, unique objects in the sky.
Wow. And
so the overall thing is about 15 petabytes. But there's sort of two key things of data. So for each of these points that you see here, here's sort of the field of view of the camera. We'll take 1,000 images of that part of the sky. And then for several selected very special points, we will take maybe 10,000 images. These numbers are still being worked out. And those will give us even more depth, as we say. We'll be able to see farther away, or we'll be able to see fainter things slightly more precisely, but also we'll get several observations a night, and we'll see things that vary on sort of hour time scales. So my interest in this is twofold. One is actually the public, or largely at least US Chilean public data for everyone. And this is such a key thing to do. But my specific thing, and I promised a little bit about dark energy, is, we look out of the night sky. And here is like the night sky. I actually forget where this image is, but it's very consistent with being like up in the hills above the Bay Area in California, or maybe LA. And you just look at it. And let's say you're there for a meteor shower and you see the meteors. So those you're seeing the lights just 10 kilometers away. You're seeing the meteors, which are actually maybe just 50, 60 kilometers up in the trails. Like you see the trails of the gas, not the meteor, not the dirt itself. But then you look farther and you see these stars. And all the stars you see with the naked eye are part of the Milky Way galaxy. And you can see the Milky Way galaxy as this long disk here, because we are largely a disk galaxy where the stars are in the disk. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, actually, from this picture, you can sort of tell that you are. But if you're in the southern hemisphere, you could see the center of the galaxy, and you could see Magellanic clouds, small and large, which are just gorgeous and beautiful. But all of these things that you see with the naked eye are actually all within our galaxy. But there are hundreds of, tens of billions of galaxies out there in the visible universe. So here is a picture of a different galaxy, kind of like our Milky Way, though, taken with a large telescope, where you can see these lanes here are dust lanes formed from dust from dying stars for another galaxy. And if you go and you look at more and more galaxies, bigger and bigger telescopes and bigger cameras, you see galaxies with all these sorts of different behaviors. These blue galaxies are forming stars in their outer reaches here. At the same time, they're red from the dust that those stars created. These other stars are little yellow, not blue. That means they don't have the youngest stars. But these galaxies, what we see is as we look farther back, as we look farther away, we're looking farther back in time, because the speed of light is finite. So if I look at some galaxy, we actually measure this way. I say this galaxy is 3 million light years away. Actually, more technically, what I mean is it's taken 3 million years for the light to have gotten here from that galaxy. And we are actually looking up out to 8, 9, 10 billion years away, and sometimes even farther for certain very special things. And what we see is this pattern in the galaxies is that the galaxies are getting farther apart from each other. That if you sort of had this grid of galaxies on the sky, then as you went forward to, sorry, did I lose the share?
No, we're good.
Great. Okay, so the galaxies are getting farther apart from each other. This is what we mean when we say that the universe is expanding. We mean that that galaxies in the universe slightly more specifically groups of galaxies, but let's keep it simple. Galaxies in the universe are getting farther apart from each other. And we sort of expected that because the Big Bang model had that there's some huge injection of energy and everything went extremely apart. Okay, we sort of had that as a loose thing, not really that we had a good first mover reason for that, but just we were running the clock backwards and that's how it worked. And we set out 30 years ago to measure how fast are those slowing down, because there's gravity attracting all those galaxies, right? So there should be, they should be slowing down their expansion. But what we found out was that they had been slowing down and now they were increasing they're accelerating the rate of expansion. So
and can I just quickly ask, I just want to say these visuals are incredible and literally this is cosmic stuff.
Right.
So thank you so much. I'm interested in, as a kid, I thought that these were photos. Whereas now my understanding is we have very sophisticated telemetry and tools to get relatively pixelated images that we use to generate these types of images. Is that safe to say? Or?
I mean, I don't technically disagree with what you said, but the way you said it, I think I disagree with what you're implying a little bit. This image here, for example, it's a picture. Sure. Is this picture probably taken with 3 different filters in front of a CCD at, 5 minutes, then 15 minutes later, then maybe an hour later? Yeah, maybe. Which is different than your cell phone camera, which has a Vera array across its pixels. Cell phones tend to use CMOS. But anyway, they have pixelated detectors. And then there's a color filter array called a Bayer array, if you want to look this up, B-A-Y-E-R. And that simultaneously is just blocking the light, and different pixels are getting different parts of the wavelength. And your camera, phone, your photo software puts that together into a color image just like that. So it's not exactly like in terms of the chemistry and the grains, but in this idea that, you're taking a picture, you're taking a picture. This particular simulation, the movement of the galaxies is a simulation. Just for the visualization, these are actual real galaxies that have been pasted on to sort of see that. So let's actually look at the camera a little bit. So the camera is about the size of my home office.
And
here.
let me we have one question from the crowd that I think may be interesting. It's interesting to me because it's a dark energy question, not yet a computational Dask question. It's from Jeff Greenspan, who asks, within a galaxy, gravity outweighs dark energy so that stars remain positionally fixed with relation to each other. Between galaxies, dark energy outweighs gravity, so galaxies are moving away from each other. Yet the Milky Way and Andromeda galaxies are set to merge in the future despite dark energy. Does this tell us something about the strength of dark energy relative to distance between structures?
It does, yeah. No, that's a great question. And that's sort of picking at the thing I elided over before. The slightly more technically correct statement at one level is groups of galaxies are getting farther apart from each other. And then at the next level, what we actually look at is we look at the cosmic web of structure, where we see both of these effects sort of playing out. So within a group of galaxies or within a cluster, a group is basically a small cluster. The local gravitational effect from the dark matter is what is the dominant gravitational thing, is keeping those galaxies together. And those groups, those clusters are getting farther apart. The fuller answer is actually, we talk about clusters of galaxies, and I'll show you some, but there are actually whole filaments sort of connecting those clusters, because all of those clusters came from just small little perturbations where the richer got richer and the poorer got poorer, as we're familiar with, and that the gravity concentrated, but it left these filamentary structures. And so one of the key things we study is we don't actually look at individual galaxies, as this particular image might show. We look at the structures and the patterns in how those galaxies are distributed over the sky at different redshifts, at different times in the universe's history. Thank you.
Awesome.
So the camera, to your point. So the camera is a 3.2 gigapixel camera, and it has a 10 square degree field of view. So that's 40 times the size of the moon. And with that, we can go and we can observe all of this region of the sky. The filters for this camera that we're just talking about, that we looked through. So what we do is we build this big telescope to collect all this light, but then we need to know what kind of light it is, like what wavelengths. And so we restrict it with a filter. And then we switch and we do it with another filter and switch and do it with another filter. And sure, that seems inefficient, but filters are much, much cheaper than cameras. This camera is several $100 million. And so building 6 of them is both expensive and actually just not optically feasible because this camera sits above the mirror of the telescope and you just don't have room to do that. So these filters are about, okay, I don't know what this means, but they're about this big. They are very large. They're some of the largest, some of the, I think they're the largest, certainly the largest astronomical filters ever built. And this is sort of the, a large VW bus. I don't know, someone measured this out, a number of corgis that fit in here, but we promise that we don't actually do that to measure. But this is a huge camera going on a huge telescope using a huge mirror. This is the mirror.
That's great.
This mirror is 8.5 meters in diameter. That basically means it's the footprint of my house. It is the circle that inscribes the square footprint of my house.
Amazing. Maybe just because I'm hungry, but when that image first came up, I thought it was a giant cake.
Right. So what we're seeing here is actually the mirror, the glass is sort of on the top part, and the hexagonal structure comes from beneath because it's mostly hollowed out on the back, because we actually want to keep the mirror very light, both for the practical reasons of its glass is heavy, but actually also thick glass cools slowly. And to get great images, you want everything basically at the same temperature. Otherwise, you get convection cycles and things. So these are amazing, huge things where they're mostly hollow and pretty thin. And we use glass for a mirror, even though we coat it, because we understand glass so well over thousands and certainly over the past 100 years, amazing developments in glass. So this is a very thermally stable glass. Here's some more recent images of the picture. So this was after they poured and cast it. This is underneath the wings of the football stadium at the University of Arizona. And this here is the mirror a decade later, where it's been finely polished to very exacting things. And it actually is a complicated design where the first mirror is an annulus. It bounces up to a secondary mirror that bounces down to a tertiary mirror and comes back up. It actually never crosses and folds. First focus is that camera. So if you imagine that camera kind of has to fit up here, that really limits how big we can make that camera, because that camera can't block this outer annulus. So you make this mirror in Arizona, and then you have to get it to Chile. Those of you familiar with geography might think, okay, well, you should go to the West Coast and just go down to Chile. But I mentioned how big this mirror is, and then it has a box, and then things are bigger. So you have to shut down interstates to do this. And shutting down the interstates in LA was just a non-starter. So we actually drove this mirror to Houston in the middle of the night. Then we'd stop and then drive it again. I mean, I didn't personally.
Yeah, but you went east. That is counterintuitive.
To Houston, got on a boat, then went through the Panama Canal and then down to Chile, because that was easier than, trying to shut down traffic in LA. So here it is. It's arrived up at the mountain. This is a few years back now. And here is where they sort of left it off. It's sitting next to its sibling. It's stunt double. It's a stunt double.
Is this the Andes or?
Yeah.
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 Wow.
So this is, I don't remember. 9,000, 10,000 feet. I should know this, but it's not on the top of my head right now, but that's roughly the scale. This is its stunt double that we use to put in things and test lifts and test to make sure that everything's going to be okay. The mirror has its own house. It lives in a little shed here. And here is the telescope it's going to go into. So it's going to go around to the loading thing, go up on the lift platform, and be put in here in the dome. And this building houses all the support stuff and all of the mechanicals and computational things needed. And then we have big internet pipes down the mountain and then up to North America. And here is a picture of the camera. So there are two things going on here. On the left is an actual picture of the camera. Take a look at it. Camera. On the right is a picture of Vera Rubin taken with this camera through a pinhole, not through the telescope, but just through a pinhole. So it's called the Vera Rubin Observatory because Vera Rubin was a pioneer in the study of dark matter, that there was a substantial gravitationally active influenced matter that was not normal matter. It did not interact with light in any way. As one of my Astro 101 students said once, you mean it's clear matter? And that might in fact be a better description. It's not dark, it doesn't absorb. It just doesn't interact at all, but it dominates gravitationally. And Vera Rubin was one of the people, the first person really, to really push that. There are a couple other people, but one of the huge, and particularly specifically to look at rotation curves of galaxies. So
we have another great question from Jeff Greenspan. He says, sure. Is there a backup mirror, or is that cost prohibitive?
The mirror was on the order of $20 to $30 million.
Wow. Okay.
Waxing and polishing. So it's just
yeah.
It's a single point failure.
Yeah.
Well, disk failure. I don't know what the right. Yeah. I remember once, not for this mirror, but there was another time. There's a 4-meter, the Blanco telescope, it's called, on the mountaintop next over down there in Chile, where I did some of my postdoc work. And they were doing maintenance on it once. And they had a person out suspended over the mirror inspecting it. And I couldn't watch. It was too stressful.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Now,
I'm getting a bit stressed.
It is, right. Now, the mirror is excellent and perfect. It turns out it's okay if you chip it. I'm not saying we should. But just as a point of optics, the mirror is completely out of focus. It's just a big mirror. You could remove a section and that would create some little problems, but it would still be collecting all those photons. It's how that gets focused down into making these points. It would be annoying. I have some friends who really care exactly about what's called the point spread function, exactly what the optical parameters look like. But it's okay if it just gets a little dinged. I mean, if it cracks, that's horrifically bad. But that's why it has a stunt double. So why do we care? So I actually so we talked here about measuring how the universe is expanding. So the scale of the universe, the typical distance between galaxies over time. And we're finding that it started to decelerate and it has been accelerating. And what's it going to do next? And I don't know, astronomers and cosmologists are that bizarre mix of humble and like ridiculously audacious. Humble in that we get the message every day, the universe doesn't care, and we just take what photons are available. Audacious in that we make statements about what's going to happen a trillion years from now with a completely straight face. But that's all we got. Like, I can't see the future. I can just predict it based on the past. We want to know, what is this dark energy? Because the physical setup is totally like you're sitting at the bottom of the hill, you each had balls, and you're betting with the other kids, how far could you roll a ball up the hill? And pretzels were on the line. And first, and you're like, okay. And a person comes up. She rolls the ball up the hill. It goes up and it's slowing down. And people are like, okay, 2 pretzels, let's make it to that tree. And then it starts speeding up. And everyone's like, wait, what? And you would conclude that there was some source of energy in that ball that you didn't know about, and you didn't understand. And that kinematic analogy is exactly what's happening here. There is some source of energy we don't know, we don't understand. One model for that is that there is just some inherent energy in the vacuum, in space-time, that when you create more space-time, because things are expanding, you get more of this energy. And that would lead to a runaway expansion. And eventually, maybe in a trillion years, it's possible that dark energy would overweigh the groups of galaxies and rip them apart. But we are nowhere near that now, just to touch back to the earlier question. So we don't know. We would like to understand, and we would like to find out. Let's see. Okay, so this, I want to talk a little bit about the structure. So this is a boring slide, but some of you like this stuff, and this is relevant, near and dear to my heart. The Ruben Observatory project is funded by the National Science Foundation, Department of Energy of the US, and there's in-kind support from international partners. Like Chile gave us, the use of the mountain. That's really important. And other international partners, Brazil is contributing internet access from South America to Miami, and things like that, right? So there's a bunch of things. There are the science collaborations. Now, this is a billion-dollar construction and operations project, but there is not actually a commensurate increase in funding to fund this, all the great science that can be done. So the science collaboration is planning how to do it, and I'll talk about a little bit about the dark energy science collaboration, which, as you might imagine, is trying to figure out dark energy. Secrets of dark energy from this data is one group. But there's also the LSST Corporation. This is the corporation that raised the money initially for the mirror through private donors and continues to work in private philanthropy to support LSST science at large scales and small scales, and with the goal of funding the science. And some of the stuff that needs to be funded is giving astronomers platforms to do large-scale data analyses. Right? This isn't big data in the sense that I can count 15 terabytes, but you know those 45 billion objects? Each of them has at least 50 things that we measured about it. So it's the high dimensionality of the data, and how do I think about that? And how do I explore that space that I'd say is really the challenge? You know, not how do I do one pass through 15 petabytes. There's an answer to that. You ask someone how big their wallet is, and you say, here's how long it takes. And I mean, I'm not saying it's trivial. I'm just saying that you can sort of understand how it's being done, but enabling the research that can be done. So we're really looking forward to partnerships. In fact, there'll be a call in a little bit for a new institute we're setting up specifically to hire software engineers to build stuff for astronomers. And we will pay them like software engineers, not astronomers. So if you are interested, actually get in touch. There'll be an announcement soon about that.
Great. So I just wanted to flag we're just over halfway through the stream. So just so you're aware.
So the Dark Energy Science Collaboration is about 1,000 people, pretty international. Based in the US, the main funding agency is the Department of Energy. The home lab is SLAC at Stanford. Our goals are to do the cosmology, or to figure out dark energy, to make measurements and understanding what's happening. But we want to do this in a way that's productive. And productive means inclusive. Productive means encouraging people. And you know, Dask has been around for 9 years. The idea of the Ruben Observatory LSST survey has been around for 20 years. These projects, span careers. So development of talent and collaborations and teams is just crucial to doing this. So we are going to use several different techniques to measure this expansion. The one that's near and dear to my heart is supernova. So these are the things where there is a point of light in a distant galaxy and it explodes. And it gets brighter and it fades over time. That's what this is showing up here. Down below, we're actually showing the spectrum at each time, the detail if you broke the wavelength in light. From the peak height, you can measure its apparent brightness, like how bright did it get. There's a special kind of supernova called type 1a supernova. Astronomers don't have brand consultants. We didn't know about that. And they are standard in their brightness. So if I observe a supernova in this galaxy, and I observe one in some other galaxy, and I measure how bright they are, I can tell their relative distance from each other, their relative distance to us, right? And I do that from more galaxies and some other galaxies. And when we did that with 42 supernova back in the late 90s, we found, as we were observing in the different redshifts, that the expansion rate was increasing recently in the past 5 billion years. And this was the first direct evidence that this really must be the case. Previous studies have shown that the universe appeared to be flat and that there's only enough dark matter to make up about 30% of what must be there. And so maybe there's something else. But that's sort of a different argument. The very direct sort of kinematic, the distances in the relation to the redshifts is just changing the way that must be is expanding. But the other one, I want to get a bit to the pattern of galaxies, because that's a bit in the theme. The cosmic microwave background was from the first 300,000 years. There were just a huge sounds ridiculous. I'll just say, stick with dense. I'll use intrinsic local misstatements of plasma. And finally, things got cool enough because the universe was expanding, and so the density was decreasing, that hydrogen atoms could form, that protons and electrons could get together. So before that, it was just protons and electrons. And light didn't travel very far, right? Light is electromagnetic radiation. If you have all these charged particles exposed and bare, light's just going to bounce around. But once you formed hydrogen, then light could travel. And so that's the cosmic microwave background we see. That was at a redshift about 1,000. That's the time when distances in the universe were about 1,000 times less than they are today. That temperature is about 3,000 Kelvin. It's now at 3 Kelvin, 2.71. So that structure, though, as things cooled, you can see which things cooled a little faster, a little slower. That pattern is the seed for the galaxies, the structures in the galaxies we see today. That's what this figure is sort of graphically, suggesting. So these patterns from the cosmic microwave background, initial little fluctuations, form into the dark matter, tell the dark matter where to go and the baryons where to go, and form these structures, and they have individual galaxies. This is a sort of conceptual illustration with time running to the right. So we are looking at the patterns and how these galaxies are distributed on the sky and measuring the characteristic sides of those patterns. So you can think of it simplistically, we have some rings, and we're trying to do that. There are no perfect rings. This is a Fourier analysis of the patterns. But that's basically the idea, that we're trying to get that sense. So it very much is exactly looking at that structure to measure the dark energy.
Great. And so this is what you end up using Python and Dask for.
Right. So so we need to measure the properties of all these galaxies. For each of these objects, there'll be a bunch of information like what shape is it? How does the light fall off for this galaxy? How bright is it? How does it compare in different filters? I'm showing a particular example here of a galaxy cluster where the gravity has lensed the light from behind it. And because the gravity dictates how light moves. And you can see that in some of these things that are stretched out in an arc. So we need to record things that look a little funny and weird and like arcs and not like this. So these are some of the types of the data that we're gathering about all this stuff, different filters. And so one of the things that Dask has done, so the LSST survey won't start till, I hope 2023, maybe 2024. This has not been a good year for things getting ahead of schedule. But Dask is starting now, and we're doing simulations. So we've created a data challenge of 1 billion galaxies and stars. Okay, the input catalog was larger than what we simulated. We simulated 300 square degrees. Yeah, the input catalog was billions of galaxies out of 5,000 square degrees. We simulated 300 square degrees. And so we took it, catalogs with what a universe could look like. We simulated the images. So, and we simulated what an observing sequence could look like. So for all this stuff across the sky, we would take an observation. So this is a 300 square degree region. And in one of these here is one image that we simulated of what the LSST camera would find. And if we zoom in on that, for example, here is one little region of that image, which has some stars, it has some galaxies, it has some things that maybe are distant galaxies or very dim stars in our own galaxy. I don't know yet. That's one of the hard things to figure out. And then we process these through image processing algorithms that measure, hey, here's a star, here's a star, here's a star, here's its property, here's its shape. They're hard problems like, I think these are 2 different objects, and these look like 2 different objects. Are these? I don't know. We call that deep blending. That's sort of hard to figure out, right? Because this, you say, oh, this is totally smooth. But let me go back to that image of this galaxy over here. Oh, galaxies aren't smooth. It's just, if they're a little blurry, you can't quite tell. They all have structure. It's just, can you see it, right? So those are the types of data that we're doing. So we've put together this data set, 150 million objects, wrote a paper about it, and we put the data publicly available. And go here. This is long. lsstdesk.org has a direct link to this. This is the site we use, the National Energy Research Supercomputing Center. That sounds right.
I'll put that in the chat.
Please do. Please do. Yeah.
lsstdesk.org. And the image segmentation challenges you're talking about are near and dear to my heart. I mentioned my background is in biophysics. We did a lot of, filament segmentation of microscopy images and stuff that is like that's kind of clear to the human eye, right? But telling a machine how to do these types of things at scale is highly non-trivial.
And the key thing that we have is doing it in a way that I understand what I did, and I know how that would impact different theories of what created those filaments. You know, that, for example, I mean, a key problem in the physical science, well, I'd say all sciences, but I'm following this in astronomy and a bit in physics, is interpretability of ML models, right? You know, is the key question, right? If I have, you know, various matrix algebra that gave me millions of parameters, and I have a fancy way of fitting what those parameters should be, cool, that's great for prediction, but it doesn't necessarily give me interpretability. I think it's totally possible, you know, and there's a lot of interest in that, but for these pattern recognitions. In this case of deep blending, as I was talking about, or figuring out the structures of galaxies, is exactly one of those things. If we have some different schemes, and we need to understand, what's your science? What did you care about? How do you maximize your signal versus someone else? But wait, there are 5,000 users. They each had a different thing they wanted to do. So how do we want to do that? So we find having an actual data set really, really useful. It has supernova. We have supernova in, so we can test these sorts of things. So like, here's an image taken, and this is simulation, right? But here's a stack of images taken in 1 year. Here's a single image in the next year. And if you subtract the two, you find two things. You find nice real things like supernova and some other things here. And we also get subtraction artifacts. So this is actually technically the stuff that I sort of think about a lot. But let's zoom out a little bit and go back to the simple picture. We measured a bunch of properties of all these things. We have some ideas of what they should look like. And so here's where we started using Dask. We had 150 million objects with lots of information, 50, maybe 100 columns of each of them. So yes, I can buy a machine where that fits in memory, but that's not my laptop and it's not my desktop. So just from that level, and then even if I did have a node at NERSC, I can do several of them and answer questions in minutes that otherwise would take hours.
And I'm just wondering, I think we have some people who are insiders with respect to your line of work, but may not have heard of Dask. So maybe you could tell us how you would describe Dask. Okay, so I think there's several different ways. As a practicing astronomer with graduate students, Dask is an easy way for them to parallelize operations on large core shared memory machines without thinking about it too much. That same code with just a little help can then run on multi-nodes and figure out how to do the communications. That's really powerful. I have a more technical thing, but you can also read the technical thing. So the distributed way of doing that, particularly since we do so much in Python, where, I mean, get a little technical here, but where NumPy and SciPy are somewhat parallelized, but basically they're only parallelized at, I don't know, 4 cores. They're not parallelized across 128 cores. There's some reasons for that, but that's basically sort of a thing. And it is just much easier to use something like Dask to do that parallelization, even if you're in memory on a large node. Than it is. And so I find it just so useful for the students to do stuff. We're just doing a lot of stuff in visualization. The next level is, okay, this is 300 square degrees of this thing. What happens when you have the 18,000 square degrees? What happens when you have all these things? That's not fitting in one machine. That has to be distributed. And how do you do that? So what we're having, so what Dask allows you to do is to have a relatively simple way of describing what you want to do in the Python you're used to, in the NumPy you're used to, and most of the SciPy stuff, and say, here's the task graph that in a parallelized way is all the things I need to do, and here are the dependencies. And there's an orchestration that will send that out to the workers and report the results back. And for all the simple examples, it works beautifully, and it's great. I think where I'm trying to push a little bit is about the interactive visualization, and the unsolved problem is how to allow hundreds of people to simultaneously and efficiently make use of the things. Because most of my life is not computationally dominated, it's data IO and data memory dominated. And you know, Dask is sort of one perspective on that. A database is a different perspective, right? Where the database says, oh, sure, we have all the data, probably in memory or probably in some parallelized thing. And people are gonna make requests and we can answer that.
But occasionally we're going to trigger a full table scan anyway, and that's going to hurt. And you don't quite know when that might happen. But the one system, at least all the data was in memory, hopefully, or something like that. And the other system, a naive way of using Dask on something like NERSC, is that each user spun up their own copy of loading all those data into memory. And the memory is taken with just that and some copies. So some merger, I think, is better. Like people talk about things being expressible in SQL. I can express most things in SQL. I love Postgres, but I can't do it efficiently. And if I'm in Python doing stuff, I don't want to write some user-defined function in JavaScript to run it in some, right? Like I want to take advantage of the same way I can reason about performance in the two things. So there've been various things, right, that work on this. There's various approaches to databases that are dropping a few of the full ACID compliance RDBMS stuff because actually most of the time I just needed to read, or I had one application or something else, or row storage is killing me and I care about speed of inserts or something like that. Well, I said that wrong. If you care about speed of inserts, column storage is going to kill you. But so those are some of the technological things we're thinking about. At a very sort of CS, simple how computers work space, this all should be equivalent. In an actual practice, technical implementations with security policy space, I have no idea how we're going to make this work. But that's my dream, is being able to do these analyses efficiently for all the people. So here is to pick up a little bit. Here's the first dumb simple thing you do if you just plotted the positions of all those things in that square. You would do this and you'd find a density. You say, oh my goodness, there's a huge gradient in density. And then you would remember about spherical geometry and that we are on a sphere. The rectangular projections of spheres, like that's a whole thing. So now we have to go implement that projection. Well, it turns out that the libraries to do that didn't quite use Dask right. So I had to read them and re-implement this to get the projection to now show us in the density. Totally doable, right? But that's different than the user being able to explore all the data thing. That's more of the person who likes playing with computers getting a thing to work. But I like this because if you stare a little bit, you'll see two things. There is truly a gradient a little from left to right in density, and that's because that's a little bit, this is shown in both stars and galaxies. So that's a little bit, the stellar density is increasing a little to the right as we approach the plane of the galaxy. But there's still a pattern below that. Not the splotches, but sort of the like clumping and stuff. That's real structure of how the galaxies are distributed in the simulation. That is the thing that we are looking for. And the thing we need to do next is you would separate all the stars, and then you'd have to slice the galaxies into what distance you thought they were away, or actually what measures what redshift, how much the universe has expanded and how its light has been shifted. And then you could look at how that pattern had changed over time and make a measurement in dark energy. So that's one of the things we're doing, the large scale structure. There's several other probes, and I'm happy to talk about all those, but just as that basic thing and that basic idea of, I'm really optimistic about Dask because I think that it allows people to do some of this stuff more easily. And if we can make this visualization with analysis stuff work fast, that will enable all sorts of great science I can't even think about. I know we're pushing it a little bit about time, but I actually
so whatever you find most exciting and Dasky. I also saw that you use HoloViews, which is and Data Shader, and we actually had one of the developers on for our last Science Thursday from Anaconda. So regulars will recognize that they're fascinating tools. But yeah, whatever you find most interesting and exciting about how you use Dask would be great in the next 10 minutes or so.
Okay, so here's another question. So about the stars and galaxies, how do you tell what's a star or a galaxy? They're largely speaking different colors. And a color is a combination of the measurements of those 6 different filters we're looking at. So specifically, these are panels. Let's just look at one of them, comparing two filters. We do things in log space. So subtraction of U minus G is the flux ratio of U over the flux ratio of G. Sorry, the flux ratio of U to G of how many photons we counted. And the stars lie up here in this color diagram. And they, sorry, the stars, here. And then in another space in R minus I, so sort of a redder color, The stars lie right here. And the galaxies are the other things. So this was useful to be able to visualize this. So this is 150 million things visualized, and I'm not running it live because I have my laptop and my desktop at work. Anyway, I don't have the computational power to run this live right now on my laptop, but we can run this live. This notebook runs live. This is a still from that. And we can go in and out and tag the data sets and look at that. And we see some interesting features. These are the stars. Our simulation had this very simplistic model for these sorts of stars. This should be a continuum. It's discrete just as an artifact of the simulation. We only noticed this when we started making these plots, and you can zoom in and sort of look at those things. So this is just so powerful, and we love it. If you set up the calculations right, it's fantastic. But you still need to know what is going to be aware and what not, what's going to aggregate, what's not, and how to read a task graph a little bit. But I really love this aspect. So just to reiterate two things, even if it's in memory, it's just faster because we're using Python. We have the global interpreter lock. NumPy is only going to parallelize up to a few cores. If I have enough memory, I have plenty of cores as a general rule, right? That's just a cost statement. Cores are cheap compared to memory. If it's out of memory, then I need to do this. Like I can't do something else. Spark, also great, lots of options about doing stuff in Spark. I can have various Scala discussions if you want.
Yeah, but one thing you mentioned is how Pythonic Dask is and how it mimics the APIs. I'll add on to that it mimics the APIs, and also it runs NumPy and or Pandas code under the hood. So debugging, I mean, you don't have to work with JVM errors when trying to import a data set, for example.
That's exactly right. And it's just the easiest bit. So I've thought about for Dask sort of how to present data to our users, and it just seems like it's a much easier on-ramp to that. Other methods also work. They are just computers. You can program them. Problems. Let's see. Where was the... I'd say when Dask works, it's awesome. Memory usage is hard to predict, hard to track, and hard to understand. But here's my shout out, Hugo. We found the Coiled post about this useful and reading and understanding the unmanaged memory stuff.
Fantastic.
I'm totally debatably for it. Like this is what my colleague Chris Walter at Duke, he's been working a lot on this. We found this useful. Then of course the documentation as well to understand the details of usage and understand the details of how memory is allocated to running systems and all that stuff. That is like, oh, right. Like the CS, not quite major part of it is like, cool. And the how do I support 1,000 users? Like, I never want them to know how to set the memory trim threshold. That's not going to end well. But that's not like it's some inherent horrible thing. I think that's just sort of where we are. And I'm optimistic that things are going to keep building and improving about that. And to echo back to things like the LSST Corporation and various sort of private support of this stuff, solving these things for the astronomy community can be hugely useful. Just paying a few months of someone's time to solve this problem might allow hundreds of astronomers to do something they couldn't have done anything in 20 different fields. That's only a little hyperbolic. That's mostly serious if we can identify those problems. So I think this is fun. I loved going to the Dask Distributed conference where we sort of met and just being engaged in that larger system of people looking at data science questions. And it's always validating. People like, oh yeah, I did the same thing. It didn't work. Or, ooh, but I found this cool thing, or being inspired by stuff. So that's been lots of fun. And I'm just gonna end with my dream. My dream is that we can have shared memory, multi-concurrent user system that can store all the data, calculate and persist analyses on a per user basis with ACL similar to what we're kind of used to in a Unix type land. This will make a huge change in how we allocate and use resources, particularly because a lot of the funding models coming from federal agencies, either for operations or from national labs, are going to buy a fixed set of computing, and the question is how to most efficiently use them. If money is unlimited and you're in the cloud, and you can spin up whatever, cool, that also works, and we also are exploring those things. It's a little inefficient, but it's easy to spin that up. But this memory thing and effectively using memory and allowing 1,000 users to share the stuff they kind of wanted to share. And to have some, if you're a security-minded person, have some understanding of this is totally fine as long as everyone agrees they're going to step on each other's toes. This is horrific for these reasons, those sorts of things, right? But what we're doing right now, Dask is incredibly powerful. And in general, spinning up your data analysis cluster is powerful. But if you are not compute limited, it's horrifically inefficient, meaning that instead of being able to use 100 nodes, I might only be able to use 10 because we all have to share. So we all sort of work along, and that limits me in what I can do. So we're following on-prem and cloud-based resources, but the cloud just puts a wrapper over the same basic problem of storing your data in memory is expensive.
This is a dream I can get on board with, Michael. I'll tell you that. And I love that you've written why you're here is to make connections and see who can help, who you can chat with, who you can collaborate with. So I think as something people can do to get involved with, I've put the link to lsstdesk.org. Is there anything else? I mean, people can check out your website and get in touch.
Welcome to email me. Absolutely.
Email.
Yeah. And I'm happy to put people in touch with people with interesting problems and some of these opportunities. In the Ruben Observatory, all the developments public on GitHub. And Dask, all the developments on GitHub. Basically, all the stuff I'm talking about is public. Some people have their own private projects, but basically all this stuff is also public. Our notebooks only run at NERSC and IN2P3 to particular sites, and we haven't quite done them as download this notebook and download the data, and they just work. But actually, if you understand how it works, they do basically do that. So totally look at the data portal site. Happy to help with that. The point is the data to be public. And while some of us feel like we know a little bit what's going on, would be great if you want to just help out. If this is a thing that interests you, I think there's great stuff that we can do. And if all we do is we share some common complaints about stupid bugs that we've done, and you learn some astronomy, that's also cool.
Great. So I have one final question, and this is more for my own interest. In all honesty, my understanding, I'm very interested in how the wide-reaching utility of Python these days. And we've talked about your NumPys and Dask and cutting-edge tools like Datashader and HoloViews. But to step back a bit, definitely correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is astronomy used to be a lot of computation in astronomy used to be in like Fortran and C source code and these types of things. So I'm wondering what you've seen over your career of the emergence of Python and why you think this has happened in astronomy and why everything's on GitHub and open now and all of these types of things.
I think, so I've written some Fortran. I've not coded on a PDP-11 manual, but I did learn Fortran from a PDP-11 manual. I've written C, I've written Pascal. I've written Rex. a whole bunch of different things because it entertains me. I wrote the cosmology library in Haskell because I wanted to understand what functional languages were. And actually, one of the things I learned was state is useful because when you're doing numerical integrations, saving state actually is really effective and efficient. But it was still interesting to do, and actually I turned that around and found some inefficiencies in how the AstroPy Python cosmology stuff was happening. Right. Python's this bizarre, interesting thing. Astronomers actually use two other relevant packages. One completely self-inflicted called IRAF. I think it's for Image Reduction and Analysis Facility, which was let's start out positive. Amazingly useful and produced thousands and thousands of great papers. From a software design's perspective, a bit of a mess. And didn't help new students learn things or do whatever. Then we used a lot of IDL, Interactive Data Language. The company has changed names 5 times since I started using it. I forget what the company is called now. But they do a lot of actually more geospatial looking down stuff. But IDL was great because it's an array-based language, and that's how I think. Like no for loops, array-based operations, fantastic. But not a very good object model. And basically a lot of global state hanging around. So it was really easy to shoot yourself in the foot. I've written stuff in Perl. I've used Perl data language. Python was the first where someone else could sit down and write some code and not like know what they're doing, but not know coding very well and do something useful. And I could read it and verify that it was useful. I have some design things that I would have done differently. But I also, both probably as part of personal maturation about what's important, but honestly, once linters came around and once formatters came around, I was like, oh, I'm just going to shut up about that. Doesn't matter. I have aesthetic. It doesn't matter because people are writing modules and they import and they don't break and people are writing all over the space. And that's great. And the NumPy and SciPy stuff has just been phenomenally impactful and so important that someone wrote that, right? Because to write NumPy, to write SciPy, to understand that, you actually have to go back and you can't do all the stuff that you sort of pretend that it's happening in Python. You actually understand how the memory stuff works, like, which is fun, but being able to wrap that was huge. And then of course, you know, computational power. The computational power to run a linter actually was not there 30 years ago. Like that would have been a thing. I mean, it was there, but like that would have been a step in your compilation. It wouldn't have been a hook that you did every time you looked away or you saved or something. So that's been fantastic. And the open model has just been hugely successful. I think when I started, there were still people who sort of hoarded their data. They hoarded their code, but honestly, they didn't really care.
Yeah.
Want their code.
I don't want to read it.
You know, I'd say one of the changes was in simulations, people who wrote simulation codes, you know, which were, that was their intellectual property. That's what they did. But even that sort of shifted once people were like, well, look, I actually we have to publish the code. Otherwise I don't know what you did. And actually what's successful is not you ran a code and come up with something, but your code is now run by 50 different people in 20 different groups and is the thing in the field. That's, you know, became the powerful thing. And so then there was a little inertia of putting stuff online. So I think once everyone else came around, once it came to the point that I could just point people and, hey, go learn Python. Go learn Python the hard way and actually do all the exercises. And then I need to pair that with some NumPy SciPy thing. And then there are like an infinite number of things about using GitHub. And I don't have to teach you any of that stuff. And they'll even teach you best practices. As an advisor, as an instructor, as a teacher, that was hugely, hugely useful because I didn't learn it that way. And so I didn't have a pedagogical model, but the community around that has just been fantastic. And LSST, the Ruben Observatory project, I think actually the other week got one of its first completely someone publicly just saying, hey, I think this would be better, submitted the PR from someone they didn't really know. And they're like, hey, thanks. You know, this is a serious construction project and it's reviewed and you have procedures and all this, but it's huge. And now I think here's what I think one of the things I saw change. Graduate students going through, part of the thing they put out there in both academic and private is their GitHub, you know, portfolio.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned before, I worked in biophysics and I saw that transition happen. It was slightly different. It was from tools such as MATLAB to Python code on GitHub. And in my years in biophysics, I saw graduate students and postdocs make part of that transition there. They started coming to me more with, you know, how do I do this in Python? Check out this GitHub notebook. And that was fascinating. Using R as well to
sure, yeah. I mean, R has some odd little quirks, but the stats algorithm stuff is fantastic. The data handling is a little funny. MATLAB's horrific. I mean, there's so much brilliance in some specific operations, but the whole, like, I'm going to call the function with different number of variables, and like that still is like, oh my goodness, that I'm sorry, I'm not, but like, is a classic, like it's totally fine for the homework exercise. Great, fantastic. But for a maintained code base by dozens of people, I can't even imagine. And there must be people out there doing it. I bet they're like, yeah, here are the 10 things you do, and you just have to do these things, and it's fine. But
agreed completely. And to give MATLAB its due, I think, you know, the way the developments made with respect to an IDE and how a bunch of Python, you know, is kind of modeled on it. Matplotlib, for example, and
it still makes me sad. I use it all the time. And the fact
Yep.
that it has this bizarre mixture of global state and procedural stuff and object and oh my,
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
I wish it wouldn't do that. You're right. Actually, that's a good point about MATLAB. And it's almost why it's, they did provide the whole IDE around that. And that is great. But I fear it made people think that you should do things with it that you shouldn't. Right? Like
Absolutely.
Visual Studio is an IDE to do things with languages that you should actually build ridiculous million lines of code or something, right? Whatever, or Eclipse or your favorite. I'm not trying to pick a winner about that. But some of the other stuff was hard. So I think Python's been so successful in doing exactly that and saying, here are some graduate students, here are some undergraduate students. They write code. It's code you still use 5 years later. And it's the community and the ecosystem that does that.
Yeah, and the other, this is getting a bit too detailed, I think, but you know, who cares? It's the end of the stream. I don't think Wolfram and Mathematica get enough due for being kind of OG notebooks of sorts.
Absolutely, 1000%. Yes, absolutely. Literate.
That was revolutionary.
I wrote,
and I may disagree with Wolfram on a lot of other things, but right.
I wrote my undergraduate thesis that was about simulating boundary conditions and hydrodynamic fluids. I wrote the simulation code for that, but I wrote the thesis and the analysis as a literate notebook in Mathematica.
Awesome.
I loved it. It had a few quirks, the bracket stuff I never quite got into, but
yeah, the bracket and formatting stuff, the way it would change, like that
was a little weird. You know, sometimes you should just tell me that there's not a better symbolic understanding of that integral instead of like showing me some like ridiculous thing. But no, I liked it. I don't know. I probably finally recycled my Mathematica 3 book because I had to admit that as much as that was a valued part of my undergraduate career, no one was going to use it. I don't remember as 3, but yeah, I love that. And I've been very happy to see that, you know, largely working with the Jupyter Notebooks. I'm excited about wider adoption and what is that, Jupyter Lab 3, that will get the books with like tables of contents and stuff, because I think that's going to help so much and really get us there. And I hope that continues. And, you know, you see both, warts is the wrong word. As I've seen IPython and Jupyter, I've seen both the fact that like, there's not a magic solution. Yep, the thing you're worried about does still happen. People have just spent a lot of time trying to make that work.
And thank you for mentioning IPython as well. I mean, a lot of people forget that IPython is so fundamental to Project Jupyter. And I think IPython in the terminal is one of my favorite ways to muck around with data.
Yeah. I mean, so the thing, I don't, some of my graduate students like do everything in Jupyter Hub, like a Jupyter Hub instance on a machine, and there are various rings that do the terminals and all this stuff. I don't as much. I keep a separate terminal because I like tracking my SSH credentials and forwarding agents. And anyway, I have a nice lawn. You're welcome to it anytime. I do have a rocking chair on my porch, but the ability to connect to the same running kernel from an IPython terminal that a lot of the Jupyter Hub allows, like, oh, that's what I always wanted.
That's cool.
And actually having to debug some of the early stuff, like doing SSH forwarding across various annoying VPNs and whatever, helped me understand what was actually happening in the client kernel architecture. And that's fantastic. And I really like that a lot. And I've been so happy to see that happen and to see how that model works with a whole bunch of different things. So that's fantastic. And I like how it really is the case that you can just say, hey, I want this problem fixed. And maybe you have some internal people, or maybe you can start a NumFocus project, or you can find someone through that being like, hey, it's worth 30K to me to solve this problem, or 50K. I don't think it's a huge issue, but I don't have anyone on my team who knows how to solve this one stupid bug. And you find someone, and you find someone's like, oh, sure, yeah, I can do that. And it makes things so much better for everyone. And that's really, I think, a huge win for the open source stuff. I mean, it's not even so much, I don't know if the code's any better or whatever. Like, I'm not actually a huge, like, thousands of eyes make code better, because I don't think you get thousands of eyes on the code. But I could make things better, and that makes me happy.
Yeah.
is an important thing.
Yeah. And the way that relates to the community as well, I think.
Right? Like, I'm tenured faculty. I don't have to prove anything. I don't have to scramble for anything. I want to make people happy. I want to make more people learn more things. And if fixing some stupid bug that bugs me in my own code, okay. But if I can fix something that actually is going to save 10 other people doing that same thing, that's part of sort of important life fulfillment. And so the more we can connect those things, I think that's really great.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on, Michael. And I appreciate you sticking around for a more nuanced conversation about open source and Python in general. I just wanted to remind people to check out LSST, desk.org. And if you want to get in touch with Michael, you can check out his website. If you search Michael Wood-Vasey, you'll find it.
If you can spell my last name, you can find me.
Great. So thank you once again for joining, Michael. That